Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. This is Josh Sharfstein. Today, a conversation about red dye number 3 and food additives. I'm speaking to Howard Sklamberg, the former Deputy Commissioner for Global Regulatory Operations and Policy at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. That's the agency's top enforcement official. He's now a partner at the law firm of Arnold and Porter. Let's listen. Howard Sklamberg, thank you so much for joining me today on Public Health on Call to talk about red dye number 3 and additives to the food supply. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Josh.
Let's start with a basic question. What's red dye number 3? I just read that the FDA has banned this chemical from the food supply.
It is an artificial coloring that is used in a lot of foods and in soft drinks, which colors them red.
Do you think it's in some candies? There's some very red candies out there.
Yes.
Okay.
And it's used pretty widely.
Now, why did FDA ban it? And I know in answering that, you may have to get a little legal to tell me about how the law works with food dyes.
Sure. So in order for a food dye to be used in making food that's sold in the U.S., the dye has to be approved by FDA first. And there's an office in FDA that reviews food dyes or color additives. And they look at, when they approve it, they look at whether they are safe for human use. And red dye number 3 had been approved years ago by FDA. There was a petition for FDA to reevaluate whether red dye should remain a legal additive to food. And that petition called on FDA to use something called the Delaney Clause. And what the Delaney Clause says is that when you're examining whether a food additive should be legal, one of the things you have to look at is whether there is evidence that it can cause cancer in animals or humans.
So for a company to market a color additive, a food dye, then they have to go to a special office and get it approved at the FDA. On what basis does that office give that approval?
The office conducts a comprehensive review of the science behind that particular color additive. So they will look at studies that have been done, and they will look at whether there's any evidence that it presents a safety risk to consumers. And there's a fee you have to pay if you're a company for that evaluation. Then FDA either approves it or doesn't approve it.
If I'm a company and I'm trying to make red dye number 321, do I have to do a big study in order to get it approved? Do I have to give it to like 1,000 people and 1,000 people get a placebo and then we see what happens?
Yes. Or you can use sometimes existing information because other people may have done studies, but you have to present serious scientific evidence. And it's not, anecdotal, gee, somebody took this and it's okay. It's serious studies like the ones you're talking about.
So presumably that happened for red dye number 3 at some point in American history.
Correct.
So the color additive gets on the market, and then, like you were saying, FDA can take it off the market because of a potential risk for cancer or evidence of a cancer risk in lab animals or humans. What was the story with red dye number 3?
So when a food additive becomes legal, it doesn't mean that people stop studying it. There are lots of academics, there are lots of public interest groups, there are lots of people interested in food safety who continue to look at evidence regarding what's in our food supply. So over time, evidence had developed that red dye number 3 is linked to an increased cancer risk in animals, in some lab animals. And so a group petitioned FDA to reevaluate its approval based on this new information.
FDA then goes through all the data and says, wait a second, this does appear to be linked to cancer in animals and therefore withdraws the approval.
Correct. And there's a phase-in period for when the withdrawal takes effect.
Now, I notice in the articles, there's a big argument about whether this is actually harmful to humans. Why is that?
Because the way the law is written is that FDA has to withdraw approval or not approve in the first place if there's evidence of a link to cancer in animals or humans. And if there's a link to cancer in animals, but there's no evidence of it in humans, FDA still has to withdraw. So it could be that there is a color additive that does not actually pose a risk to humans, but FDA has to withdraw it anyway.
So there may be some defenders of red dye number 3 making that case out there somewhere.
That's right. And FDA would say, we are not telling consumers that they are undergoing risk of cancer because they have consumed products that have red dye in them. This is something that we have to do based on our evaluation of the science and the legal standard.
So does this mean that we won't be eating red foods?
No, because there are other red dyes and there are also natural flavorings. So there will be manufacturers who currently use this will have a period of time where they can look for replacements of red dye. I'm not an expert in exact colorings. Maybe the color will look a little different, but people will barely notice.
Now, I understand that this petition wasn't filed last month. This has been something that's been going on for years. Why does it take FDA so long to respond when concerns are raised?
There are a few reasons. One is a resource question in FDA, which is that the part of FDA that oversees food additives, including color additives, is quite small and has a large workload. And there are often delays and backlogs in its evaluation of petitions. And there's also a process within FDA where it's not just that particular part of FDA, but other parts of the agency that have to weigh in as well. So these processes often take a long time.
When you say the office is kind of small, do you think you could count the employees on your fingers and toes?
I would say the people that are involved in it, so that office plus others in the food part of FDA, if it's not fingers and toes, it's a little more than that, but not much more. It would not get into dozens. It's very small.
Now, what does this decision mean for other color additives? Are there other color additives being reviewed right now? Do you think we could be hearing more from FDA about these?
I think there is, this makes a lot more public, the idea that people could and perhaps should continue looking at evidence that exists, once an additive is approved. So I think we'll see more of them. And it's also possible FDA can initiate the process itself and doesn't have to wait for petition and it may be that a new administration wants to do that.
In the meantime, if someone wants to stop eating red dye number 3, what should they do? Look at the label?
It would be on the label. It's listed.
Got it. All right. Let me switch gears for a second from red dye number 3 to other types of chemicals in the food supply. Talking about chemicals in the food supply has been trendy recently. It's certainly in the news. We have Robert F. Kennedy Jr. talking about chemicals in the food supply, but also the whole concept of ultra-processed foods has to do with different chemicals that are added to the food supply. Are they all regulated like color additives, or is there a different approach taken?
The regulation is different for additives that are not color additives. And it gets a little complicated, but there are different pathways where additives can be legal to be added to the food supply. So there is first someone can petition, much like you would petition FDA for a color additive and get actual FDA approval. But most of the time, people rely on a concept called generally recognized as safe, or GRAS, GRAS. And most food additives are legal in the US if they are GRAS, to use the lingo. And there are two ways for a company to go about making sure that a food additive is GRAS. One is it can file with FDA something where it asks FDA's opinion on it. And FDA will react to this filing. And a company will file, these are very lengthy documents, often hundreds of pages, talking about studies that have been done that show, in the company's view, that this food additive is GRAS, and FDA will either comment or not comment. And comment means basically we think it's okay. And no comment is basically, we don't think it's okay. There's another pathway which is more common, which is self-affirmed GRAS, as it's called, which is that a company hires usually a consultant who does the study and makes a conclusion, and the company never files anything with FDA, but simply keeps that study in its own files and produces it to FDA if FDA asks. And that's a process that's used that has been in place since the late 90s and got formalized in 2017.
Got it. Let me make sure I understand. So there are two paths. One is the company comes forward with all the evidence and gets FDA's opinion about whether some chemical to be added to the food supply is safe. But the other path is that the company just does the study on its own and just goes forward and adds it to the food supply, essentially asserting that that chemical is safe. In that pathway, did they tell the FDA they're doing that?
They do not. FDA can take action afterwards. So if it's doing an inspection or if it gets information from people or if it is just looking at what's in food, they can ask the company for its evidence of GRAS, as they call it. And FDA can disagree and then FDA can take action. But it's very reactive. It's not a process where FDA knows beforehand.
I'm going to ask you the obvious question. You were very involved in enforcement at FDA. Is it ever the case that a company adds something to the food supply, but they haven't done the necessary research and they just sort of are hiding behind this idea that they're allowed to self-assert the safety of chemicals?
Yes. In short, yes. And sometimes they do the work, but FDA disagrees. So there are different companies on the spectrum of this. And there are an awful lot of additives. And it's hard to enforce after the fact. It's difficult for FDA, and the processes are a little bulky.
You know, sometimes people think of the FDA because of the way it regulates drugs as always having the evidence and making decisions. But with food additives, what you're telling me is that FDA often doesn't have the evidence about whether food additives are safe.
That's right. And the best way to think of the difference between food and drugs is the analogy of a recipe. With drugs, you either submit with an application to FDA or there's something called a monograph for over-the-counter drugs, which very specifically says what has to be in your recipe. Active ingredients, non-active ingredients, and exactly in what proportion, exactly how it's done. And you cannot deviate from that recipe at all. Food is not like that at all. The regulation is much lighter. There isn't, color additives aside, there's not a pre-approval system for food for either additives or obviously food products. FDA is not approving lasagna, but it's also not approving any artificial flavors, pre-approving any artificial flavors that would be in the lasagna.
So I bet a lot of people listening to this podcast would not have understood the phrase GRAS reform if we started the podcast with that.
It sounds like a cannabis type issue.
But we're going to talk about it because there's a lot of discussion, given the weaknesses of this system for additives to food, about reforming the GRAS system, otherwise known as GRAS reform. What are the ideas out there for GRAS reform?
So one of the ideas is to do away with the self-affirmed GRAS and to require companies to at least notify FDA of new food additives that they're using, and then give FDA an opportunity to weigh in. And there are different variations of this. Either FDA has to weigh in or FDA is just told, but doesn't have to say anything. And that's one of the principal areas of reform. The folks who would push back on that would say that reform doesn't work unless you provide FDA with more resources. Because one thing I can say, I've worked at FDA, you've worked at FDA, is that if you give FDA a new responsibility or a new authority without resources to do it, the authority might as well not exist.
There's always the risk in that setting that people think the FDA is doing it because they have the authority, but then they're not doing it because they don't have the resources.
Which is worse in a way, because then people get an assurance that's not really there.
Okay, so one option is provide more resources to the FDA and have a requirement of information that's submitted. Any other major GRAS reform ideas? Do any of them perhaps suggest regulating other food additives more like the color additives that we talked about earlier?
Yeah, and there is obviously, there's been a push in the news about ultra-processed foods, and there are certain particular types of food additives that people are interested in. And some of the science is stronger or not as strong, depending upon those. And there are some folks who think there has to be, beyond a GRAS system, an approval system, as you say, like there is for color additives. So you can think of the world as three different ways of regulating this. One is the self-affirmed GRAS. You do it yourself, you hire people, and if you do a sloppy job, you have the risk FDA enforces after the fact, or you can get sued in civil litigation if you harm people. So I would always advise somebody do a good job on that. The other is a notification requirement, basically, but not a pre-approval requirement. And the other is a pre-approval requirement. And that's the spectrum.
Presumably, for all the chemicals in the food supply, that would be quite a task at this point to do a pre-approval requirement.
Yes, and you would need a lot more resources for that, and probably a fee. Color additives have a user fee that's paid for the employees, which is how drugs work, or some other big funding source.
For some of these changes in regulating food chemicals to take effect, would you need an act of Congress, or could FDA just wake up one morning and start the process of changing the way it regulates the GRAS process?
FDA could reform the GRAS process by changing regulation itself. The current system, the self-affirmed GRAS system, is based on a regulation that FDA finalized in 2017 that FDA had proposed initially in the 90s. So FDA could reverse that by regulation.
Now, they proposed it in the 90s and finalized it in 2017. That makes me think that if they were going to reform it, it could take a very long time.
Regulations can often do take a really long time. FDA can move more quickly when it wants to, when it's very motivated. The reason it took a long time in the previous reform is FDA put out the draft version of this regulation and let the self-affirmed GRAS system operate. And then they wanted to see how well it was doing before they finalized it.
If FDA were to fundamentally reform the GRAS system, what's the shortest amount of time you think that might take?
I think the shortest way to do this would be multitasking. So first, if FDA had a concern about particular types of additives, it could take action under the current system on those additives. So it could say, this particular food additive, we've looked at the science, and company that is using this, we do not think it is GRAS. We're going to issue a warning letter and give you a time period to stop using it. And any companies that use it after this date, we're going to go to court. And they can do that under the existing rules. And the warning letter can be done very quickly. And that's a public announcement that then affects behavior and that gives consumers information and gives companies information and starts the ball rolling individually. And if you do that for a few additives, you have the effect of changing the way people think about the system. Then there's a longer process of if it wanted to change the regulation itself. And you have to go through a bunch of administrative procedures to do that. Put out a new regulation, get comments on it, and then finalize it. And there could be litigation and things like that.
I mean, that's probably, that part of it is probably at least a few years.
Yes.
And in the meantime, FDA can be talking to the American people about food additives. Is that fair?
Absolutely. There is no regulation on talking.
So in theory, FDA could say, here are products that are out there that are self-affirmed. Here are products that we have looked at the evidence on and perhaps could be providing more guidance than the agency is today to people about the degree of evidence and review for different chemicals in the food supply.
Absolutely. And a lot of the choices in what we eat are choices we make ourselves based on information. And there are certainly foods that are legal and under the existing law should be legal, but that would not be a good idea for somebody to eat in large amounts.
Well, I think I started with candy. I'm ending with candy on that point. Your point's taken, Howard. I will try to take that to heart. And with that, I want to thank you for joining me to talk about red dye number 3 and food additives more generally.
Thank you very much.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, Stephanie Desmond, and Grace Fernandez-Ciceri. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Michael Bonfils, Spencer Greer, Matthew Martin, and Philip Porter, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production coordination by Catherine Ricardo. Social media run by Grace Fernandez-Sasiri. Analytics by Elisa Rosen. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.